All right, here we go. We're looking at On the Ledge. It's October the 17th as we record this session. And a short week, so oddly enough, a short week with a hell of a lot more to talk about. So we'll try and get to it within the next 35 to 105 minutes, whatever it takes. So welcome back into the show. Former Premier of Ontario Kathleen Wynne is here this morning. John Wright is with us from Maru Public Opinion, veteran pollster, and brings the sense and the pulse of what's going on in the province to the show every week. Tim Hudak is back. We know you were at the Police Association last week. We weren't quite sure whether handcuffs were involved or whether it was just the keynote. And veteran Queen's Park reporter and commentator Keith Leslie is in the house as well. And of course, every week I send out the list. What is it that you guys want to talk about? And Keith comes back and says, we got to talk about Therme. So we will get to the spa no matter how much time there is in that, because it's just one of those gifts, I guess, that depends on how you're talking about it, that never seems to go away. But before we get to all of this, the story yesterday that hit the news probably late in the afternoon, and we had already sort of somewhat agreed on what we were going to talk about. And then Kathleen, you said, well, I guess we better talk about this. Rob Benzie at the Toronto Star releasing details suggesting that not only are we going to get an economic statement at the end of this month on the 30th, but each one of us is going to get a $200 check from Premier Ford. And in fact, everybody in the house is going to get one. I'm just going to put it out there, and considering your first reaction, Kathleen, give me a sense of, where you stand on all of this.
Well, it's pretty blatant electioneering as far as I'm concerned, Dave. This is a government that's still in deficit, although I suspect that when the fall economic statement comes out, we will see magically that a lot of that deficit has disappeared. So I suspect that the finances of the province are in better shape than they were projected to be. So that's good. Except that if that's the case, then giving everybody in the province $200 really makes no economic sense. It just makes no sense to me. If this were a means-tested rebate or check that were going out, you could probably make an argument for that. I mean, it is a time of year when people are struggling and struggle even more. And there are lots of people who could use some extra cash. I get that. But there are lots of people who don't need $200. And this is the same challenge I had with the $200 check that I got from Mike Harris. And, that was kind of at the beginning of my political career. It was so outrageous to me that money that could have been used for other things in the province that are desperately needed, it was not being used. So $3.2 billion. There's a lot of good that could be done in the province for that amount of money. This is the run up to an election. That's what it feels like to me.
Well, it does, and I think all of us would agree. But on the other hand, Tim, if you actually go back to the funding that the Harris government handed out, I think there are going to be people who will tell you, well, yeah, I spent that money in the economy, and so I put that money to work. We can argue as to whether or not that's more beneficial in the short term, but we're still running a huge deficit. If nothing else, whether there was better places to spend the money, where did the fiscal conservatives go in this province?
I really have two lines of thought on this, Dave. So here's thought one. I mean, I put in my pointy head economist hat. Sort of the conservative thought that I would bring to the table is, first, I'd like to see some of the debt pay down for good reason. Accumulate a lot of debt through COVID to keep things afloat. If we have some extra revenue, let's start paying that down. And then if I were to target a tax, I would look at income taxes and business taxes, because I believe that means that people will work harder, they'll invest in the economy, will create jobs and better economic growth. That's the pointy tipped hat there. Here's the other school of thought. I do think that the Premier Ford is keeping the door open for an early election. And, to avoid what happened to David Peterson, where he called the early election and lost, I think he needs two things. One, not a surprise. So you socialize it early. People are talking about it. And secondly, you need to actually have a case of your mandate. Here's my plan, right? My investments in infrastructure, my investments in keeping communities safe, and a rebate like this one. To work, you need the other parties all to be on the opposite side of the argument. So I see this as part of a package of how Ford could get an additional mandate in 2025. Bottom line is, well, I've got one point of view. Doug Ford has done this before with an education rebate. He cut the gas tax, the licensing renewal for our cars. They're very eye-level tax breaks for ordinary Canadians. So my point is, I lost my election. He won his. So maybe he's on to something.
Well, even when they made the announcement, John, about the upcoming economic statement, the finance minister sounded like a campaign ad himself.
We're investing in infrastructure, building roads, highways, hospitals, schools, transit, and homes. We're cutting red tape and keeping taxes low to make Ontario one of the best places to invest.
So, that's not a surprise that that's the tone we're going to get. But he actually kind of laid out in terms of, what it is we've already done, what it is we intend to do moving forward. Can there be too much on this plate at once? That is to say, can there be too many things that we can point to or criticize, either or, that becomes something of a distraction rather than a focused, here's what you're going to get from a Ford government?
Well, I think a little bit like Tim, I'm of two minds on this. The first thing is, when you're in the off season before an election campaign, there is a lot on your plate, and therefore it's not really going to have that much of an effect to add an extra setting. I think when you take a look at this government, they're sitting comfortably at 44%, 42 to 44% in the polls, and they've been able to do that even though they've got a number of controversies under their belt. The second thing, however, is that if this is a prelude to an election campaign, then it becomes a much more sharp end of the stick. The campaign is fashioned around certain phrases and certain things that they're going to do. And as a result of being in the driver's seat, the government has a way in which they can focus that agenda very, very carefully. So let's say that this government decides that it wants to go to the polls in the spring. Now is laying the groundwork for that. And part of it is giving out the money to people to put in their pockets.
Well, Keith, part of the reporting on this has suggested that not only will we hear about the $200 a person for this, which becomes the headline and maybe the distraction and other things that are in the economic statement, i.e., what will the deficit be? What are we going to project, and where's that money going to come from? But, Colin DeMello at Global suggesting that we might find out what the booze deal actually costs us. Maybe we'll see more costing around Therme. I mean, we've already had the big reveal last week. So, is there an opportunity to kind of bury some of those bad news stories with the effect of this shiny, here's $200 in your pocket?
Well, the $200 it's going to work. I think fiscally it's pretty reckless, but politically it's pretty astute, especially when you're keying people up for an early spring election a year ahead of schedule, and you're going to give out these checks in January and February. When Mike Harris gave out those $200 checks, he was in a surplus situation, not a $10 billion deficit, although I suspect, as Kathleen pointed out, in the fall economic statement, it'll come in much lower. But this is a $3 billion plus hit to the fiscal books. So it's going to be, the deficit's not going to be wiped out by any chance. So they're giving this money out in a deficit. Back to when Harris did it, I used to do some lectures at J schools, and I would often take along some Canadian Press style guides, and I'd auction them off to the kids with quizzes. And one of my questions would be, name me a cabinet minister other than the premier. And invariably it was like pulling teeth. Even though they would be like, third year students ready to graduate, they didn't know the cabinet at all. Except for the year they all got $200 checks, and their arms just went straight up. Ernie Eves is our treasurer, because Ernie Eves signed those checks. It works. There's nothing like giving people $200, especially in January and February when the Christmas bills are rolling in. Politically, it's going to work for them, although fiscally, to Dave's question, whatever happened to the fiscal conservatives in Ontario, I think they look at this as sort of, a cost of doing business, and you're absolutely buying people with their own money, buying their votes with their own money.
So isn't that, an interesting juxtaposition then, Tim, when we look at the money that's going back into your pocket from the province, and that hasn't happened yet, but presumably based on what Rob Benzie is saying is going to happen. The federal government, on the other hand, I think the carbon tax rebate is going into your bank account, if not this week, then soon. But the feds just can't seem to get any traction, to point to Keith's point, in terms of it feeling like this is a great thing for me.
Yeah, the carbon tax is a different animal altogether, because you pay every time at the pump or for your home heating and such. And most people will be dubious of any government that they're going to get that or more back. I don't think they buy that. Yeah, we get the checks in the mail, but it also reminds us that every time we go to the pump, it's 17 cents a liter more because of the carbon tax. I was one who voted for the $200 rebate when we were in surplus back in 2000. If I had known it would buy lawn signs for Kathleen Wynne, I might have had a second guess about actually saying yes to that. But this is real money, right? I mean, talking a family of four, for example, $800, highly visible in an era of affordability. So while a line of economists, might give it the thumbs down, man, this sort of thing connects, and it connected back in 2000. An affordability crisis, likely even more.
Yeah, well, and I think that will be the buzz. I mean, clearly that's the sort of that kitchen table, to John's point, eye level discussion that you're going to be able to have around, the money that's coming in. Where am I going to spend it? And if it turns into more Christmas gifts for the kids or paying down the credit cards, either way, it's probably hard to fight. Now, having said that, and a couple of weeks ago we talked about the state of school boards in Ontario. Boy, I read this morning in the Globe, and we've got another school board that has decided to go out and spend money completely tone deaf. And I don't care if they're in surplus. I don't care if they've got the money. I really don't care if they've figured out a way to pay for this, but it was a junket to Italy to buy art for a new Catholic school. And John, I don't understand what goes on around a boardroom meeting where somebody says, I know it was a bad idea for those people, but for us, we can justify $145,000 for a 5-day trip to Northern Italy to buy art for a new school.
Well, I'm going to echo what I said last week or the week before when Tim and I were talking about specifically about the history of the school boards in this province and how they operate. And I know that there's this idea that they are local creatures and that they respond effectively to, local concerns and school boards with students and the trustee system. But, to the broader scale, this is the sort of thing that prompts people to really question the accountability of school boards. This is the wedge that gets into people's minds when people call for the abolition of the school boards. There are just so many things that can be done using $145,000 both in the classroom or for other things. And this is exactly the kind of situation which, we saw many years ago where spending was out of control. They weren't being spent on the right things, and it provided the opposition parties with a real opportunity to go after that level of government. So I think it is tone deaf. I think it hands it right to the Conservatives that they want to use this for their own leverage. And it also reinforces the fact that there's a lot of misspending within the system that taxpayers are paying for.
Well, Kathleen Wynne, you made the case for the trustees 2 weeks ago. Aren't you getting tired of having to defend this nonsense?
I'm not going to defend this, Dave. There's no way to defend this. It's ridiculous. In 2000, when I was a school trustee, this would no more have been acceptable than it is today. So this is just not on. It's ridiculous. And it's ridiculous on two levels. I mean, it's ridiculous because of the cost, but it's ridiculous because of the substance of the trip. So to be going to Italy, as I heard someone say on the radio this morning, these people are not art experts. This is not like you've got a board full of art experts who are going to go and do something that nobody else can do. So it's ridiculous. It undermines all those arguments I made about school trustees. But the other thing it does is that it undermines the case for Catholic education in the province, because these folks were not going on an information or educational trip. They were going to buy art, and they were going to buy religious art. And so, I mean, a majority of people in Ontario don't think we should have a Catholic school system anyway. And so this just further undermines the capacity of the Catholic system to be relevant. So no defense here for any of this.
Well, and here's the problem, and I would think that even those who are in the Catholic system aren't quite sure how art Keith, from Northern Italy is going to enhance Catholic teaching in the Catholic system.
Okay, you get a bust of the Pope. I get that. I'm pretty sure we can order one of those online. We don't need four.
Yeah, you could do the Amazon thing and have it here in like 48 hours.
Yeah, free delivery. 4 trustees going to Northern Italy. This is after the chair, and the chair, of course, is one of them. And they changed the rules just before this so they could fly business class and first class hotels and all this kind of crap. As Kathleen, there's absolutely no defense for this. And it does. That was my first thought is, how dare you? You're just putting that whole question of Catholic school funding on the line. I mean, there's only 31% of Ontarians are Roman Catholics. We still fund a separate school system. It is really gets up a lot of people's noses. I know John Tory tried to address it to some degree, and it backlashed on him big time. But this is an issue that's going to come up again. And this is exactly the kind of reason that will bring it up. But to me, first of all, you've got $145,000. You're going over to spend, I forget how much they were going to spend just on the art. Here's an idea. How about putting some Indigenous art in that school? How about going across Canada maybe? And, as part of Truth and Reconciliation, bring some art that brings some meanings to that school. Given the church's history with residential schools and everything else, this is just so wrong. And here's an opportunity they could have had. We're making a trip in Canada to buy Indigenous art and put that in our schools and teach our students about that. How about that instead of $145,000 for 4 people to take a trip to Northern Italy? Flying business class, holy cow! It's just mind-boggling. And I know we can lead to Tim, who's going to say, "Well, this is why we need to get rid of these school boards."
Well, but here's
your thunder. Sorry, Tim.
That's what I was worried about. We're going to have that conversation again.
But Tim's the guy who's the parent on the parent council of a Catholic school here in Toronto. So, dance around that one for me, Tim.
Not going to dance on that. Look, I'm a product of Catholicism, proudly so. Notre Dame College School in Welland, and now I'm on the parent council of Loretto Abbey in North Toronto, and proudly so. And yeah, Catholics, we like our statues. We're into the statuary. But as Keith said, there's got to be a St. Francis of Assisi to get a little banged up for cheaper, $145,000 from Northern Italy. By the way, St. Padre Pio Dave, he is actually the patron saint of stress relief. So maybe
that's perfect.
Issue. That's why they're bringing him in. Look, this is it is outrageous. We have our parent council meeting next week, and I'll bring it up, and I'll bet you'll be really pissed off the reasons that Premier Wynne said and Keith, that this is an embarrassment to the Catholic school system, 100%. But it does, I will reinforce, this is the 3rd strike in 2 months for bozo behavior by school boards in the province of Ontario, Thames Valley and London, the TDSB, now the Brantford Area Catholic Board. My goodness, we should just admit that this thing is rotted, that there's some disease that exists in this infrastructure. It's not going to happen this mandate, but I'd love to see the next government take this on and say, there's got to be a better way to get more money into the classroom as opposed to the waste we're seeing in school boards.
Well, I've been at the Abbey. My wife and daughter are alumna from the Loretto Abbey, and there's some really nice art right in the Abbey itself. You might just want to offer up some of the stuff that's there. There's beautiful artwork in the chapel, all that stuff. Yeah, I'm just saying, you can do everybody a favor. Couple of things that are also making a lot of noise. And that would be, I guess, the idea that we're getting our paper bags back at the LCBO. And it's really hilarious to me. This was one of those things that just drove me crazy. When the LCBO came out, I guess, a year ago, and said, we're not going to have the paper bags anymore. And somehow tried to convince me that it was saving, I forget, 180,000 trees a year. And this is what drives me nuts, is that they clearly do not understand how paper bags are made, first. Second, the government at some point signed off on it and decided that this was a cool thing to do. 6 or 8 months later, the premier blows wise and figures that this is a way of helping people who are suffering because of affordability issues or whatever it might be, because they don't want to have to spend the $2 or $3 on fabric bags. It was just got crazy. And then they went back into, had to go back into procurement. Their bags are going to come back. This whole story suggests to me that the government, let alone the LCBO, has no handle whatsoever on a climate strategy. And I know that might sound like a leap, but paper bags actually store carbon because they are a paper and a wood product. period. They're recyclable or they're compostable. So they're better for the environment than any of the fabric bags that we've got out there. I know this doesn't rank up there, Tim, on the level of the green belt, but this kind of stuff drives me goddamn crazy.
Well, yeah, and I'm a customer too. Maybe sometimes too often if you look at the empties in our garage. But look, I'm happy the premier made this decision. I just think it's practical for folks. I mean, maybe I should be better bringing bags everywhere I go, but I'm comfortable carrying bottles in my hands. They're heavy. What we ended up defaulting to was using their boxes and carrying out boxes, whether you got a couple bottles in there or otherwise. I think this connects with average folks, and it's kind of a common sense thing to do. I will suggest, though, Dave, that my gut tells me, and I'm curious what the premier's thoughts on this, that I don't think this would have been something that would have been brought to the premier's attention or cabinet's attention. I suspect the LCBO made this decision. They wanted to genuflect in the direction of being green. I bet that is sincere, but I don't think it was run by the political level. It emerged as an issue, and as is common with Premier Ford, he had an instant gut reaction and told him to turn it around.
Well, there is reporting that suggests that the CEO at the LCBO, who saw the announcement coming back to say, we need the paper bags, was in contact with staff in the premier's office to say, what the hell, are you guys looped in on this or not? Why am I just finding out about this now? And it sounds like you weren't involved. But Kathleen?
Yeah, no, I agree with Tim. I mean, I don't think the premier was probably part of the first conversation. But look, I mean, my challenge is just in general. I have 6,000 of these reusable bags in my house, and I was surprised when the LCBO made this decision around paper bags, because like you, Dave, I thought that, and there are other grocery store chains that are going to paper bags, right? Like they're not going to give you a plastic bag, but you can get a paper bag. Anyway, it was incoherent to start with. I totally understand why Premier Ford would have stood up and said, this needs to be reversed. But, to your point, Dave, about there not being a plan, there is no plan. There's no climate change plan in this government. And so that's why it feels incoherent. I think that it's a populist move to do this. I think it actually makes sense. But it's not part of the fabric of a plan that would actually address climate change in any way. And quite frankly, this government isn't interested in doing that. They're not interested in talking about where they even do have a plan, which is, capping industrial emissions, which I think is a good thing. But this is going to appeal to people, and it's going to make sense. So again, there is a fabric of pre-election, and this is part of that.
Well, on the other hand here, I hear Mike Schreiner talk about how important it is to make sure we're saving every tree. Again, and I go back to the minutia of this, but the beauty of the paper bag actually saves the environment only because we're using parts of the tree that are useless otherwise. And that's where we have the actual climate.
You make that pulp, and it's part of an industry actually that is an Ontario industry. So it's actually a good thing.
Wait now. So here we go. The next step here is the fact that they've looked at, they've had to go to procurement to find out, who is going to manufacture these bags all over again. And the global news reporting suggests, well, it was a Quebec company. It's not really, we couldn't find somebody in Ontario. And when I looked it up, turns out that the company is now owned by a larger firm in Cincinnati. So we have farmed out the making of our paper bags at the liquor store to a U.S. company. Now, I guess, Keith, the good news is it's not China.
Well, come on. I mean, so many of our forest products that used to be, processed here in Ontario, they'll go shipped to Quebec now anyway. So this is not a surprise that a Quebec firm, that they're owned by Americans. I didn't know that part, but that's the way the world is these days in business. But that it went to a Quebec company for the paper bag, that did not surprise me in the least, because of what we're able to do now in Ontario. As Kathleen said, this was a key thing that was produced here. I'm not so sure it still is, but they've ended up in Quebec with it. I think the whole idea of the paper bags, and I think Doug Ford was onto something here, is if you're picking up 1 or 2 bottles at the liquor store, there's nothing better than a paper bag inside a paper bag, boom, you walk out. But, if you're buying 3 or more, or you're getting, the recyclable bags are handy. But again, to Kathleen's point, and I saw this on TikTok last week, there's people now that they open their closet doors and literally thousands of the recyclable bags fall out. We have accumulated too many of them. There's no two ways. I think every household has. But you don't go to the liquor store on a daily basis, I don't think. And it's not too hard to remember to take one of the bags with you when you're going to the liquor store. If you are going there on a daily basis, may I suggest one of the recyclable bags because you're buying a lot of booze.
Well, there's a bigger problem than the climate problem.
That's kind of what I'm saying.
For sure. Yeah, but that's the point, John. If you got a closet full of these bags, they're not recyclable. You would have to use them tens of thousands of times, given the number of bags you've got, to actually get to net zero.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I don't know how we've accumulated probably 100 of them here, and yet every time we go out to the grocery store, we're looking for a
You don't have
plastic
one.
bag. I mean, it happens to everybody. Look, I think that there's a retail level pedestrian aspect to this, which is very common sense. And I think, when you use that word, it's about making sure that people have choices in life. This is not just about the LCBO, but it's also when you go out to other places and you're gathering groceries and you're forced pretty much to buy a recycling bag as opposed to having the option for a paper bag there. I don't want to get into the issue too early, but I mean, it's a little bit like saying we're just going to have bike lanes, throughout the city, and it's going to reduce emissions, and therefore it's going through no matter what. People want to have discussion and balance in this. And I think, when you take a look at how much energy is made to produce these bags, how many of them have been made, and how little they are used often because people forget, or, something like that. What's an extra 25 cents? I think having the option of the paper bag is a good one. And I think it will be received really well.
All right. Well, let's get to the bike lanes. And, you talk about there's no balance in that conversation, although there was balance on Bloor was the focus of discussion here in Toronto this week.
Across our province, we're seeing an explosion of bike lanes, including many that were installed during the pandemic when fewer vehicles were on the road and their impacts on traffic were unclear. When strategically placed, bike lanes are a vital part of every city, offering residents a safe and a reliable way to move around. What cities should not be doing, however, is taking away lanes of traffic on our most congested roads, like for the underused bike lanes on Cedar and Joseph Streets in downtown Kitchener that are making it difficult for emergency vehicles to get through, or O'Connor Street in Ottawa, where lanes were pointlessly taken away on the key artery, making it unsafe for drivers and cyclists alike. And of course, Bloor Street, Arbor, and College right here in Toronto, Yonge. These streets are less than 500 meters apart from one another.
And I guess when we get to that stage, it's what I found interesting, John, was that the minister cited other cities before he got to Toronto. But let's face it, this is all about, picking a scab at City Hall in Toronto.
Yeah, I guess it can be. I have to declare a conflict of interest because I live in Toronto. I have a car, and our entire neighborhood is under construction for bike lanes and streetscaping, which is the new term to try and make everything look good. Except the problem with that is you don't have workers who show up to actually keep the maintenance in it because they're at a coffee shop. I think there's a sense within a number of cities that, what are we building all of these things for? And I mean, you can have the unfortunate cause of maybe 6 or 7 people being killed a year, and God knows I want to make sure that doesn't happen. But I think the evidence to people is the reflection on the fact that they've got these bike lanes that are taking up all of that traffic space for cars that could be used that are completely empty. I live in Midtown Toronto. There's the Eglinton Crossway, of which there's going to be the LRT that goes underneath it, but it's also got bike lanes on both sides of the road. And again, the political wherewithal for somebody to say, we've got to do this for the environment, I don't really think that has much of traction. But I have evidence by my own eyes that every time I go there, I don't see any bikes on it. It's millions and millions of dollars. The only thing I think is, well, maybe they're planning for 30 years from now when there's a dome over the city and everybody's walking and biking somewhere, because during the wintertime, it's just not going to work. So I think it's one of those issues that plays to a certain segment of the population, particularly in Toronto. And I think, cities, there's a sense of frustration that there's nothing you can do to fight City Hall. They're just going to go ahead and do something.
Yeah, but Tim, we got into this conversation a couple weeks ago when we started talking about the tunnel of love there that's being pitched at Queen's Park. This is not an answer to congestion in Toronto. To me, it's the equivalent to saying, well, let's just make the sidewalks narrower, and that'll offer up more space for vehicles. We can make the same argument, but that's a stupid argument. So anecdotally, I get it that in some cases this matters, but this can't be the answer to congestion.
I think it's part of the answer, though. Like, I do believe this is a genuine response to the kind of frustration that John just expressed that many people are feeling in Toronto and potentially Ottawa, Kitchener, in other areas. Honest to God, Dave, it feels like we're part of some bizarre social experiment where the city bureaucrats connive with the transportation department at U of T and Toronto Metropolitan Sociology Department to see how we all feel when transportation goes haywire, when roads are blocked for construction, bike lanes come in and we all get stuck in traffic, Gardner closes down. Like, it is an awful squeeze. And I have no doubt that politicians at the local and provincial level are inundated by people who are saying we've gone too far out of whack. Like, honest to God, it feels like we sort of went to sleep during COVID. We didn't move around as much. And when we emerged from that slumber, major lanes were taken away and bike lanes were put in place. I don't have my ticker, but it does seem that there's not that many people using them. So sometimes the province needs to self-correct. If the school boards, municipalities, creatures of the province go to an extreme, they're not making the right decisions. I do believe the province plays a role of mom and dad to try to get that pendulum back into balance.
Well, I guess here's the problem that I have. There are so many there's low-hanging fruit here, Kathleen, in terms of trying to get around downtown. Two things: trying to drive along Richmond at any point here in the city of Toronto. The left lane is always blocked by delivery trucks, if not by construction crews working on the latest redevelopment of something on the south side of Richmond. That's one. Two, I had a meeting downtown yesterday. It took me less than 20 minutes to get into the core from Don Mills. Transit never would have done that for me. So this is excellent. I'm cruising up Yonge Street, and there's a blocked lane there. And the lane's blocked because it's a traffic enforcement vehicle from the Toronto Police Service, and there's nobody in it. He's just got the flashing lights on. So seriously, there are a whole lot of other issues that we could be addressing before we get to bike lanes in Toronto.
Yeah, I think this is, again, a hot button issue that Doug Ford thinks he can win political points on. I mean, the bigger issue for me, and I'm completely in the opposite side in terms of the bike lanes. There's no evidence that demonstrates that the bike lanes are the problem. And, the articles that have been written about this admit that, the government's not bringing forward those numbers and showing how the bike lanes are actually obstructing traffic. So there's really no evidence here, but this government is not famous for evidence-based policy. So that's the first concern. But honestly, Dave, the bigger problem for me is that this is a very local issue. And this government is intent on diminishing the power of the cities, particularly Toronto. I mean, witness the action around the size of council, and this is another example of that. Doug Ford is really still very annoyed that he's not the mayor of Toronto, and so he is going to do everything in his power to use these hot button issues to undermine the authority of the local government. I think it's bad precedent. I think it's bad policy. And, I really hope that Olivia Chow and council, I hope they push back on this, because it's really, it's very intrusive.
Well, let me push back, because, the same thing was said when you were sitting in the premier's chair and John Tory wanted to put tolls on the Parkway. That was probably a good thing for us at the time.
Well, it wasn't a good thing regionally, Dave. Here's the thing. The reason I didn't go for that was there had been no regional consultation. There'd been no discussion with the 905 about how that was going to work. And John Tory was sitting at a table with all the mayors from the Greater Toronto Area. This had not been brought forward to that table. There'd been no conversation about it. And he and I had a general kind of philosophical conversation about tolls, and I was supportive of tolls. We put the high occupancy toll lanes in place in Ontario on some roads. But the very thing that I'm talking about that has not been done in terms of these bike lanes is there was no evidence for this policy, and there was no evidence for the policy that John was bringing forward on a regional basis, and it was a regional policy. So, you know, I'm being pretty consistent here in terms of requiring that there be a discussion, there be consultation, and there be some evidence that the policy is going to work.
Yeah, Keith, it's easy to say, you know, it's a creature of the province, et cetera. But Olivia Chow making the point that, you know, you're kind of nibbling away at our opportunity and ability to be flexible and deal with the issues at a very local level. And it's not lost on anybody that the biggest gripe is coming from the stretch of Bloor Street that runs through Etobicoke, which is hometown Ford.
Well, of course. I mean, we know that Doug Ford is doing this politically, and as Kathleen said, without any evidence to really back it up. But I think the bike lanes are sort of a victim of Toronto's everything everywhere all at once attitude. And I think this is the reason that John talked about, you know, streetscaping and making things beautiful, and the construction and the subway lines and the traffic lanes and the bike, everything. You just can't get around the city anymore. It's near impossible. You had a good trip getting down, then you're sailing up Yonge Street to a point and find it blocked by a police car enforcing traffic, which is not ironic. It's just stupid. But it's not a surprise, right? I mean, we know that the congestion in this city is in part because of everything going on. Everywhere you turn, there's either lanes taken out for construction or for parked vehicles doing deliveries. It's a big enough city that they might have to start looking at the New York approach of, you know, having deliveries only done in the evenings and overnight periods, and having a congestion fee and having all these sorts of things. But to Kathleen's point, you have to do these with consultations. And ahead of an election is not a time when someone wants to float these kind of ideas where you're going to have to pay more to come into the city, because it's just politically, it doesn't sell with anybody. But it has to be done sooner or later, and someone's going to have to be brave enough to do it. But here we have the province dictating what the towns and cities can do with their bike lanes. It does seem like, you know, they should push back on this and be allowed to do what they want, but they should also come back with some coordinated plans. And yeah, you know, perhaps Bloor Street's just not a good idea. I mean, it's not just because Bloor Street is one of the richest stretches of road in Toronto, and then heading out to Etobicoke, Doug Ford's home turf. It's because it is widely used. It's a major thoroughfare for getting across the city. And the bike lanes, for the most part, they're not empty all the time, but it seems to people who are sitting there in traffic not going anywhere that bike lane they keep looking over at is empty.
Well, I had to kind of laugh when I saw Siobhan Morris's report at CTV, and she's out, you know, on that stretch of Bloor Street. There were more bikes than there were cars at the time that they were doing their live stand up on there. Now, I get it; it's all anecdotal.
And Dave, can I add 2 points?
Yeah.
2 quick points. I think there's 2 things that are true. I think it is true that the Premier Ford, having, you know, been on council and having Toronto at his heart, anything in politics, everything, you know, a lot of your decisions are from where you're from. So I think it's natural. He'd be more inclined than the leaders to interfere in Toronto operations. But I also think it's true that from time to time, the province does need to, you know, carry the big stick. Here's an example. Municipalities have done a lousy job at getting homes built. They too often bow down to NIMBY forces. There have been examples in this government and previous ones where the province enforced upzoning. So you'd actually have more homes built, more commercial areas. It was necessary. And I suspect that there's been such an outcry that bike lanes went too far, that button was pushed too often, that now there's a backlash and the province steps in.
Yeah. So what do we do? To incite that level of courage that we need politically then, Tim? Because that's really what Keith is talking about is there are things that we're going to have to do to prepare for, you know, the next 30 or 40 years in a large growing, fast growing urban center like Toronto. How do we incentivize at a political level some level of courage to say, I know you think it's a war on the car, but it's not. There's a whole, you know, large, wide-ranging view of how we're going to not only get around in this city, how we're going to be productive in this city, how we're going to actually get from, you know, deal with the growth, the innovation, all of the productivity issues that we need.
Yeah, it's a great question when it comes to transportation. I think in any good policy, when you're working with municipalities, by way of example, you need to have carrots, and then you need to have a stick if the carrots aren't taken up. housing side, right? The carrots would be that you get to keep more of the land transfer tax revenue. Your project for that bridge, road, arena, water, sewer, what have you, goes to the top of an infrastructure funding list to reward getting more homes built. And if you don't, then I think the province does have to force zoning. So I think same here, John. I think what the province can do on the positive side is to use provincial funding to help improve transportation. We're seeing some of that on the rail side, roads, bike lanes in the right spot. But at the same time, ultimately, you do have to have that stick to utilize if they're not using the tools that they're afforded.
Dave, can I just say something on that? You know, I agree with what Tim's saying, and I think that unless you're paying very close attention to city and provincial politics, you really don't have, I think, any idea what the overall plan is. And so I think one of the ways that there can be incentives in place for people to put up with challenges is in traffic or housing or whatever, is to understand where we're going, you know. And it's interesting that the city brought out an economic plan just in the last couple of days. But again, that's got to permeate into people's day-to-day lives, so they know what it is, the vision is, and where we're going. I had a staffer who always used to say, you know, people need to be able to see the beach. They're not interested really in the flight to the beach, but they want to know what the beach looks like and that they're going to get there. I don't think we have a sense either provincially or municipally in some places, and Toronto being one of them, of exactly where it is we're going. And that is where I think the too much all at once feeling comes from, because it's like, well, why is all this happening and I don't know what the point is, you know? So I do think we need a better sense of where we're going.
Well, John, let me just counter that and just suggest for a second that the bitch about the crosstown that you point out is we're not getting it done quickly enough. You know, we could never get anything finished or completed in this city. So we're really in a conundrum here in terms of where the public sits in all of this.
Well, and Dave, look, I mean, you're talking to the person who was the Minister of Transportation when that project started. And don't doubt for a minute that I don't at 3 o'clock in the morning wake up and think, what the hell went wrong? You know, so I totally get that. But one of my challenges with Metrolinx when I was Minister of Transportation was getting information to people. So to my point about people knowing what's going on, I think the lack of transparency on why this is taking so long has just been outrageous. And it has created such anger and resentment in people because they don't understand. It just looks like incompetence, right? And so I just, you know, to my point, people need to have information. They need to know what's going on, why it's happening, where we're going. And we've had none of that. I couldn't even get Metrolinx to agree when I was first minister to put up signs on the scaffolding around projects to give people a sense of the timeline and what was going on and giving them some information. So we pushed through that and we actually got some signage, but that's a minor thing, but it's indicative of this reluctance to share information. And that's what creates resentment in communities. And I think we're at a very high level of that in terms of the lack of transparency in Toronto.
Well, let me jump in for a second and agree with what you've just said and also what Tim just said, because I think if you look overall from those of us who live in major urban centers, the LRT, let's call it that for a moment, is a disaster, not only in Toronto, but if you have to look to Ottawa and even Calgary, where it's even more of a disaster. It seems,
but not Waterloo, John. It's great in Waterloo. Beautiful.
Well, it may be in Great and Waterloo. I'm going to move there if they don't have too many bike lanes. But I think part of the issue then is when you take that issue of the crosstown and the bike lanes and the congestion downtown and the uncoordinated nature of the construction, the frustration is not just about the priority, but there's a sense that the city is broken. There's a sense that money is being spent on things that should be better prioritized for its citizens. And I think, again, there is no arbiter to this. I can accept the fact that the premier used to live here, so he understands it. I can accept the political fact that he wants to curry favor with more ridings in the next election campaign. But I can also accept the fact that there doesn't seem to be anybody who can coordinate, one of the largest cities in North America, and somebody's got to do something to help the residents and the city prioritize. So we've got a lot on the go here, including the subway, that's just being built as well, but nothing seems to be working. And the priorities, even though we seem to have a deficit and we've got, other things we want to do, we don't know what the primary plan is going forward.
Right.
So I think he's on fertile ground for political support.
Okay, well, we promised that we wouldn't finish up without getting to it, and it's hard to believe that Therme is still making noise in the media. But I found it interesting, Keith. Last week, the details were released in terms of what the government was up to, and how what some of the details of the deal was with the province and Therme specifically. What I found astounding was that it was only yesterday, as we record this, that Bonnie Crombie, the leader of the Liberal Party, came out and started to talk about it. What happened in that week?
That's a really good question, because I was glad to see her come out and talk about this as well. But as you say, it was a week after the figures come out showing that this is a really, really lousy deal for taxpayers in the province. I mean, it's just crap. And I don't want to get into numbers, doing math on a podcast is really not good for anybody. But basically, the best summation of it that I heard was that Taylor Swift's economic impact in 6 nights will be 1/3 of this 95-year Therme deal. We're spending $500 million up front to get the land ready for them and to build the parking garage. And they're going to pay back between $1.8 and $3.2 million a year for the next 95 years. That's just a really crappy deal for prime waterfront land in Toronto, downtown Toronto, and the Ontario Place site. So why Bonnie Crombie took a week to get to this, I don't know. But as I say, I was pleased to see her, jump on it. But she didn't get very much traction as far as news stories go. I mean, she tried to make it a $2 billion boondoggle. She's come on to some new math. And there's just so much math going on in this. As I say, it's hard to know where to really land on it, but it does in the bottom line. It just looks like a crap deal. And the government only put out these figures and gave it the release because they know they're being audited right now, and that's going to come out further. But the bottom line is they should never have signed this deal. And there's a huge poison pill in it. If they want to cancel it, it's going to cost something like $30 million now. But if they don't do it now, something like 10 years with 5 years notice before they can do it, it's really, really a crappy deal.
I've got polling on this that was done recently and released into the public domain. And so in the Toronto situation, and a good sample size, you've got a 52% support for what's going on. I mean, you've got a split public here on the Science Center. And you have close to 70%, in fact, who believe that the swap between the Gardner and Ontario Place is a good deal. So again, it's not like it's an 80-20 proposition where people are against it. So I understand, all of the minutiae, the details. I don't want to get into that, but I'm just leveling it from a public opinion polling area. Is that it's not an issue which the public is going to the barricades over. There's half the public in this city who don't like what's going on, but the other half do. And the second thing is, it sounds to me is a bit of a joke. I mean, we need to get Taylor Swift back for 15 concerts instead of 5 and have the province sponsor it. That'll pay for the whole darn thing. So I do think that, it is a really important issue, but it's not having a lot of traction of negativity in the city.
Well, doesn't that kind of speak, Tim, to what we were just talking about in terms of, there's just so much noise out there. There's okay, I've heard enough, just whatever's going to happen. I'd be curious to know, I don't know how you measure indifference in your polling, John, but I suspect that there's a certain level of that. And Tim, that plays into this, doesn't it?
Yeah, you got some hardcore fanatics, right, who want the Science Center always be where it is and just keep it frozen in 1975 as it has been. But I suspect a lot of people, they just get on with it. Look, Ontario Place was resembling a Scooby-Doo abandoned amusement park, right? It was just awful that this, what could be a jewel had languished for so long. And I'm actually pleased to see something that can be a new jewel, not only for folks in Toronto, the GTA, but for the province as a whole. My advice on this, Dave, would be, I think Therme actually has to go on the offense, because they kind of battering around. They're very quiet. It's described as a spa when I read it. It's more like a water park for average families to enjoy. You talked about Metrolinx, and Kathleen talked about how they're not being transparent. People get it can be hard to dig these long tunnels. I'd like to see both of them out a bit more, just being honest with people about what the projects will mean, because I think we're all grown-ups and we'll get it.
Yeah, but Kathleen, on the transparency issue, that's what has been, I think, the biggest sticking point around the Ontario Place redevelopment. It's not that we don't want it. It's not that we don't want it to have some beautiful spot to go down on the lakeshore and use. There just seems to be so much that's veiled in, well, soon come.
Yeah. And I think that it's, to the point about why did Bonnie come out a week later? I don't know. I'm not part of her comms team, but we're about to go back into into session. The legislature sits Monday, I think. This is going to be one of the things that the Liberals and the NDP are going to be asking the government about. And it's part of this kind of pattern that I think is pretty clear in terms of Doug Ford and his cronies and who his decisions benefit. Who are his people, and his people are well-heeled. His people are big business, and I think that's what the lack of transparency around this deal leads to. It's certainly what the Greenbelt pointed to, and I think that it's an argument that can be made about him and the way he's done government. In terms of the Science Center, I mean, I represented the riding where the Science Center sat. I was thrilled about the Eglinton Crosstown because it would go right by the Science Center. There's a neighborhood right next to Ontario Place with kids who, otherwise would never get to a Science Center. Anyway, ask Michael Koto about his relationship to the Science Center. He grew up in Flemington Park. And so the reality is that there's lots about this that is unsavory, I think, whether we do the math or not. That's why the opposition is going to keep asking the government about this, because it fits into that pattern of, well, who are you actually helping here? Whether the spa or the water park is going to be a great thing or not, I really don't have an opinion about that because I don't know at this point. But what I do know is that there seem to be a lot of questions about who's going to benefit from the deal, and that's what the opposition is going to be going after.
All right, so we'll leave it there because
sorry, Dave, but the business case says they have to attract more visitors than Canada's Wonderland.
Yeah.
Does that seem likely to anybody at this point? And if they don't, the taxpayers take the hit. So I just wanted to make that point, just how lousy a deal this really is.
Yeah.
And if they don't cancel it now or as soon after the next election, we're stuck with it for at least 15 years.
All right, so let's leave it there because we'll have plenty to chat about next week because, yes, the legislature is back in business at Queen's Park. So who knows what, this was a short week and plenty to talk about. Kathleen Wynne, John Wright, Keith Leslie, Tim Hudak, thank you all for being here. And just a reminder, folks, if you haven't done so already, it's if you're listening on Apple, Spotify, wherever through the audio, make sure you follow and subscribe to the show. And you can do so on YouTube as well. It's been really interesting to see how the YouTube audience has found us over the last month or so. So if you're new to the show, great. Thanks for being here. And just hit the subscribe button on YouTube. We're doing it for On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast, as well as Now and Next. We had our comms folks dissect the Kamala Harris Media Week last week. So we'd be curious to see what you think about that. If you've got a comment, feel free to leave it wherever you're listening to or catching the podcast. That'll do it. Thanks. This is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast for Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.